Nick, coming back to you, just on your assessment on how the two campaigns performed. Obviously, in hindsight being 2020, you can say, what a well-oiled machine the Trump campaign was. Look at the results. The Harris campaign fell apart, et cetera, et cetera. Just, yeah, maybe to drill down a bit, your question on Harris as a candidate, some of the challenges maybe that she faced, not to provide excuses, as it were, but some of the challenges maybe that Trump faced as well. Just if you look at Harris's performance versus Biden, as of about 2 hours ago on the latest available data, Harris didn't outperform Biden in any county by more than 3%. So if you just look at measuring her against another Democratic candidate, what do you think of the two candidates, and just what particular challenges they faced? Is it for Harris, if she chose a different vice presidential pick, would she have done better maybe?
Yeah, so I think it's important, firstly, to just say that we must avoid monocausal explanations. And there's going to be a lot of people running around saying, oh, this is the reason she lost, or this is the reason Trump won. And it's not any one thing. There's lots of different things that came together to create the soup that is this particular election. I think the story here really begins with Joe Biden refusing to step down and instead decide to run for another term when he was clearly not really up to it. And that essentially kind of put the Democratic Party in this difficult position where it had this candidate who it wasn't super enthusiastic about, wasn't having great numbers, and just got weaker over time. And the Trump campaign, particularly against Biden, I think was just razor sharp focused on just hammering and hammering and hammering all of the failures of Biden's presidency. And I think the Trump campaign, particularly in the first half of the election, was just absolutely laser focused on hammering Biden. And ultimately, after that, that's one of the reasons why Biden challenged Trump to an early debate. He seemed to believe, Biden at least seemed to believe, that if he went out on the debate stage, he would be able to seize back momentum in the race. Now, ironically, that's what completely ended his presidential run, driving him back basically off the stage. And then the Democrats were left with this problem of, okay, who do we rally behind now? We don't have time for a primary to choose a new candidate. No one is willing to step up and basically take over a campaign with 90 days to go, which for an American election is very short. And then if they lose, they're going to get blamed for inflicting Donald Trump on the country again, which is something that the Democrats in particular are really, concerned about. And inside their own party, that's kind of losing to Trump is the death of your career. I mean, look at what happened to Hillary Clinton after 2016. So when Biden came out the gate and dropped out and then endorsed Kamala Harris, and then Harris very quickly and very effectively jumped on that, rallying support within the Democratic Party behind her, she sort of created so much momentum that the Democrats have no choice but to go along with Kamala, who has quite frankly not been a very talented candidate. I think she's still haunted in many ways by the specter of her first run for president back in 2019. She didn't even make it, I think, to 2020 in that primary season, where she just ran an absolutely awful campaign. She was very far to the left on a whole bunch of issues, even for a Democrat, isolating more moderate voters in her own party. She took positions that came back, I think, to haunt her in this election. And she just showed that, particularly when it came to interviews, she often would fumble questions and drop the ball. She seemed to kind of wilt under pressure somewhat. And I think that very much played into her loss in this election, is that she just wasn't a super talented candidate. I think her campaign was actually run relatively well. I think that they were relatively focused. She tried as hard as she could to run away from her previous positions and tack to the center to kind of reinvent herself. Whether that was possible or not, I think, is a question that we'll never really know the answer to. But it clearly was not possible in 60 or 90 days or so for her to do. And while I think Trump's campaign, the wheels came off a little bit towards the end, I think they had built up so much momentum and the environment was so much in their favor, particularly with Americans very unhappy about inflation and the way the Biden administration handled inflation, that I think Trump really benefited here from an anti-incumbent mood in general. And Kamala, despite her best efforts, was identified very much so with Joe Biden's legacy to some degree. And just on the inflation point, because this is, I think, something that's going to come up again and again in discussions of why Trump won. Defenders of Biden will point to the inflation at the moment in the country and say, look, it's low, it's normal, it's back to normal levels. Why are people so upset? It can't be inflation. But that's not really what happened here. Yes, inflation has calmed down from the peak it was during the middle of Biden's presidency. But I think a lot of people have forgotten, and I think ordinary voters didn't necessarily forget how the Biden administration tried to deal with the issue of inflation. Their first response was to sort of pretend like it wasn't happening. Then they tried to say, no, no, it's only temporary. Then they said, no, no, it's not so bad. We'll fix it with this or that. And eventually they passed this giant piece of legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a lot more to do with a lot of other proposals and projects that Democrats have been keen on for a long time. And not, economists will argue as to whether it actually did anything to affect inflation, but I think the perception really set in then that Biden and the Democrats were not capable of dealing with America's economic issues. And so when they had an untalented, relatively unknown candidate, I mean, you think that being the vice president would make you more known, but actually, it's a position that is not well respected and actually doesn't give you a lot of opportunity to do things or make decisions. I think a lot of voters said, well, we don't trust Harris. She's, connected to the guy who we really don't like. Biden's approval rating is, I think, below 40% at the moment. And we don't trust her party to do the right thing when it comes to economic issues. And we just don't know her well enough to buck that trend. So a lot of things going into this mixture, but I think generally speaking, both of them actually ran pretty good campaigns. One last thing I will say is that I think Trump has been much better at embracing sort of unorthodox or non-traditional campaigning methods. So I don't think Trump had a very good get out the vote on the ground operation this election, and yet turnout for Republicans was pretty good all over the place. Whereas Kamala, or Harris rather, had an excellent turnout the vote operation, particularly in the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. However, she failed to turn out the voters that she needed there, as Chris, you alluded to, underperforming Joe Biden in many, many, many counties across the country. And I think this suggests that politics in the US is changing, that going on a very popular podcast, which is something Harris didn't do until quite late in the campaign, for example, is actually a much better way of driving turnout than having door knockers to pull people to the polls, because I think a lot of the time you just end up pulling the people that you normally would get. I mean, it can't hurt, but I think what Trump's shown is that, thinking a bit more out of the box and taking on sort of these more non-traditional ways of running an election are actually quite successful. So it remains to be seen whether that holds for other candidates, but that's my feeling of the shape of US elections going forward.
Herman, coming back to you, just on this confluence maybe between values or moral concerns for voters and economic concerns. Nicholas has spoken a bit on the economic side, inflation, that sort of thing. This is one sort of story, but you had at one of Trump's latter rallies at Madison Square Garden, a comedian who spoke at that rally referred to Puerto Rico as a floating island of trash, paraphrasing. So you had the more inflammatory rhetoric, maybe not always from Trump, but from those sharing the platform with him. Per the latest exit polls in Florida amongst Puerto Ricans, Harris won them 52-43. In 2020, Biden won them 69-31. So are you seeing any changes in terms of what US voters, what their preferences are? I know that's a very big question to say all US voters, but anything you want to add on in that regard?
Well, I think two things are important to understand, I think, what happened here. That gaffe at the rally came very late in the campaign. By the time that happened, the Republicans had already invested significant capital in pre-voting and postal voting. This was an own goal that they suffered in 2020, when the Trump strategy was essentially to denigrate and eschew postal voting, early voting, and of course that led to the gnashing of teeth when over a short period of time the votes were tallied up, and it actually favored so heavily towards Biden that it won him the election. So there's that point, is that I think the Republicans got out the vote early enough that it inoculated much of its support against any late term shocks, any late gaffes like that, which might have otherwise, in a more traditional election 10 years ago, depressed turnout and changed those outcome numbers. So that was a strategic success from the Republicans this time, and some complacency from the Democrats, having so thumped the Republicans 4 years ago through postal voting. I think there was something of laid back, or perhaps not required intensity to the Democrats, making sure that they can reassert that advantage that saw them do so well in 2020. So that's the first point. It just tactically, in the mechanics of the campaign, the Republicans got out the vote early enough for such late campaign gaffes not to really matter. The second one is more tonal, and for this we can look back over the last 20 years. And I always use the example of Mitt Romney. Objectively speaking, I think anyone would be able to agree that Mitt Romney is a decent man. He isn't scary. He isn't far to the left or far to the right. He is surprisingly without scandal, even though he's been in the public eye for the second half of his life. And as candidates go, as about as from central casting as is possible to be, a man with a hairline of immaculate precision, a jawline that could cut perhaps not through the Electoral College, but perhaps through Rick Santorum. And this wasn't an offensive candidacy. It wasn't a radical candidacy, nor was it really anything out of the mainstream. And yet, when he ran against Barack Obama in 2012, he was denigrated by the Democrats as the man who wanted to kill grandmothers, who gave employees cancer, who really wanted to bind women physically. Joe Biden said Mitt Romney wanted to put Black people back in chains. The moment you start upping the rhetoric of intensity and over-the-top tonality of viciousness, and you apply it to someone as milquetoast as Mitt Romney, you become the party that cries wolf. The Democrats played that card successfully against Romney in 2012, but then they had nothing left in the chamber when someone like Trump, well beyond the typical mainstream, well beyond central casting, became the opponent and the target of their message. So when you then turn up the rhetoric to 11, when a presidential campaign has a speaker, has a comedian, says something that is, unwise, particularly within a sensitive electorate, I think you suffer from the fact that you've lost voters in terms of whether your alarmist rhetoric at a consistent intensity becomes anything other than just white noise. So I think that gaffe, which it undoubtedly was neutralized by the Republicans' strategic decision to fix their early voting mechanisms that didn't work in 2020, and simply by the Democratic failure to not appreciate that Donald Trump is a different type of candidate. The usual outrage doesn't cut through. It doesn't work. He is so beyond what one might usually associate with the mainstream that when he veers beyond it, or his campaign goes beyond it, it just loses its impact as something to use politically.